Yeah, so there's been a lot of debate about this. One of the interesting findings from Easterly and Levine was that more ethno-linguistically diverse countries in Africa were not more likely to have civil war. And I think they kind of expected they would find it. I mean, they reported kind of sheepishly, like, oh, we didn't find it, everybody thought we'd find it. Again, especially in the aftermath of Rwanda and whatnot, with the caveat that I told you that for Rwanda, the data is a little bit out of whack with reality. Since then, it's been very hotly debated. In some of my own work, I haven't found a very strong relationship. There is some work, though, claiming that there's no clear relationship between ELF and conflict. But if we look at other, it's a little bit like Evan's question, like there are other ways of looking at ethnic divisions that do predict conflict. So there's measures of what are called polarization. So the ELF measure is a fractionalization measure. It's just a measure of concentration of ethnic groups. There are other measures, of polarization. And polarization indices are interesting. They say that conflict, there's some models of this, economic models. Conflict would be most likely in some models if you have two equally sized groups, 50-50, that are both large, that can both mobilize. That's when you're going to be most likely to fight. Whereas if you're Tanzania with like 50 small groups, no one group is large enough to really take on anybody else, so you don't have as much conflict. Those studies show that the African countries that have an ELF of around 0.5, which is where polarization peaks, actually do have somewhat more conflict. So there is a relationship between ethnic structure and conflict in Africa, but it isn't as simple as just saying the more diverse you are, the more conflict you have. Okay. So how can we, the question, how can we design policies or think of ways to address these potential economic costs of diversity? And a natural place to look is Tanzania. Let me say one more thing before we get into the details, because I think people may be interested in it. Folks have looked across US cities at ethnic and racial diversity and at local economic growth, and they found the same negative relationship. So if you control for various factors, more diverse municipalities in the US have slower economic growth. Bill Easterly's a co-author in one of those papers. I think for those of us who live here in the Bay Area, those kinds of findings are strange. We are such a diverse part of the world and part of the country. It's such a vibrant area we live in, so innovative, with rapid growth and technological discovery, and people often point to the diversity of the area as being central to that this is an area where ideas mix and new ideas come out of that mixing. So it isn't like it's always the case that more diverse areas have slower growth at all, and I think the Bay Area is an example of that. But there could be the sorts of effects Easterly and Levine talk about as well. That if diversity leads to bad policy in some cases, or conflict, or political rivalry, maybe the Bay Area is Tanzania. There's so many different groups that no group becomes dominant. In cases that are more, where there's more political rivalry between groups and more of a kind of winner-take, a sort of zero-sum, winner-take-all mentality, then maybe that's where you see these negative effects. Okay. So Tanzania, yes, go ahead. Yeah, so I mentioned there's fractionalization indices, I mentioned polarization indices, and there's segregation indices as well. So the segregation indices measure residential clustering or dispersion of groups in areas, and US cities have all those measures as well, and people have made the case that, sort of like what you said, that maybe when groups are very divided and separate, that's when you have more of the negative effects. Although that's a debated literature. There's a lot of debate about how much, I think it's called like the contact hypothesis, how much contact between people of different groups changes attitudes. I think most of the recent evidence suggests contact between people of different groups tends to ease any discrimination between groups, but that's a very contested research literature. So let's turn to Tanzania. Tanzania has had the most, quote, serious nation-building policies in Africa. And let me tell you what that means and why that's interesting. That's really the focus of this paper of mine comparing Kenya versus Tanzania. In the last lecture, we talked about this attitudes and the attitudinal and behavioral change program in Sierra Leone, ABC. Nation building is related to those kinds of programs. I'll tell you exactly what Tanzania nation building was. But part of it was changing people's attitudes and identity. In the case of Tanzania, really an attempt to strengthen their attachment to the Tanzanian nation. The notion of how to get people to believe in and feel attached to their nation was a very important issue in sub-Saharan African countries, say in the 1960s and 70s. These were new countries. They'd just been colonies. Most of their boundaries, the borders of these countries, had been drawn by European colonizers with very little attention paid to what the political reality was on the ground. They were very artificial. The Germans and the British and the French and the Belgians got together, put down a map of Africa, a very incomplete map of Africa in 1885 at a very famous conference in Berlin, and they literally just drew lines on the map. Okay, this is French, and this is British, and this is German, and they further carved up their territories into countries. And then in 1960, all these artificial countries became independent nations, where very often people had very little attachment to the nation. In fact, some of the countries had names that were really almost just sort of like, map distinctions. There's Central African Republic. That is not a name that people would choose for themselves as their country. If you have a nickname, you don't say my nickname is, 5'9", brown eye. No, that's a little bit boring, right? Maybe for an online profile or something, but you have a name, it has meaning, it has historical meaning. France isn't called Northwest Europe. It could be. I mean, it's right there. It's Northwest. Let's call it the Northwest European Republic. That's like Central African Republic. It's so absurd to think of that, because France has a history and identity, and that name goes back, 1,000 years. So we get a sense that these were very weak national identities. Tanzania tried to strengthen that identity, and the Sierra Leoneans are trying to do it now too. And the question is, can you strengthen identity to make people attached enough to their identity, their institutions, their culture, their nation, and will that change behavior? Okay, so this is the case study. We're going to focus on Kenya and Tanzania. It's a very nice comparison. These are two neighboring countries in East Africa. They border each other. They have very similar climates. They have very similar size. They have very similar population. They have broadly similar ethnic composition, at least in terms of broad language families. The specific groups are somewhat different. They were both British colonies. And in fact, they're a great example of these arbitrary national borders. So the border between the countries was set in 1890 between the German Kaiser and Queen Victoria. Actually, they were cousins. And they were trying to figure out how to separate this territory that lay between them. And they proposed drawing a line that went from the coast up to the 1 degree latitude line, because that was the middle of Lake Victoria. And then they drew a line across Lake Victoria. Queen Victoria very modestly named the lake after herself, or maybe had somebody name it for her. It was very generous of her to give her own name to a lake. And that became the border. So it was just like looking on a map and drawing. In fact, it was very interesting because Queen Victoria wanted to be very generous to her cousin, and said they realized after they drawn the border that line went right through Mount Kilimanjaro, this massive mountain, the largest mountain in Africa, and she very generously offered to give Mount Kilimanjaro to the German Kaiser as a gift. So they drew the border around Mount Kilimanjaro, and the border kept going on. So the decision-making for borders was completely nuts. Tanzania was a German colony until 1918. After Germany lost the First World War, it became a British colony. So from 1918 until independence in the 1960s, both Kenya and Tanzania were British colonies. There were some surveys done in the 1960s, right after independence, to try to understand political attitudes in the 3 East African countries, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, including by this paper Koff and Vandermeul. And they asked information about, they were asking high school students their attitudes about politics, about democracy, et cetera. And basically, Kenyans and Tanzanians looked extremely similar in these surveys. Again, they had this sort of common British colonial schooling, they had British colonies, and the standard of living was very similar in the two countries. So basically, they looked very similar. The 2 districts we're going to study are 2 districts you guys have seen before: Busia district in Kenya, Meatu district in Tanzania. They're about 500 kilometers apart on opposite sides of Lake Victoria. They were both chosen because they were poor districts that the same NGO wanted to work in, and similar cropping patterns. Meatu is a bit drier than Busia, but most people grow maize and sorghum, and so like broad agricultural patterns are similar. Similar levels of ethnic diversity, although Busia is a little bit more diverse. And in both cases, and this is very important, communities play an important role in local fundraising. So there are traditions of communities chipping in funding for schools, for water, and other projects. And we're going to look at that fundraising in communities in Kenya and Tanzania to try to understand how ethnic diversity affects basically village-level politics in these 2 areas. So this is the map. See Tanzania and Kenya there. Busia is just northeast of the lake. Meatu actually does not border the lake. It's a bit southeast of the lake, so that's another difference between the 2. But despite all the commonalities, there were big differences after independence. And this is really the nation-building program that I mentioned. Part of the difference between the 2 countries can be traced to the political ideology and philosophy of the 2 independence leaders, their personalities, their orientation. The president of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, was very pro-Western. He sided with the US and Britain and the West during the Cold War, and Kenya followed basically quite pro-market economic policies. Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, was a socialist, pan-Africanist. He wanted to work towards African political unity and pursued socialist economic policies. He was aligned with China in the 1970s and was very actively supporting the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Here are just pictures of the 2 leaders, Nyerere on the left, Kenyatta on the right. They were actually similar ages. Nyerere was a little bit younger at the time. Julius Nyerere is a very interesting figure. He was a school teacher before he became a politician. He was very charismatic, and to this day is a very admired figure among those who study African politics. He was considered one of the least corrupt post-independence leaders. He lived very humbly. After he retired, he moved back to his old village and lived in a hut where he'd grown up. He just wasn't a person who he actually stepped down voluntarily. Kenyatta was different. Kenyatta built a huge empire for his family. When Kenyatta was president, he bought tons of land or found ways of acquiring lots of land. So his family are still the largest landowners in Kenya. His son is now president of Kenya and is basically a billionaire off all the land that his dad acquired while he was president. So quite different than Nyerere, just in terms of their own personal, you could say, values, or I don't know how ambitious they were in some sense. He was very ambitious for his family, and Nyerere wasn't at all. Okay, so what policies did they pursue? Tanzania, under Nyerere, from very early on, did a number of things differently than Kenya. So in both Kenya and Tanzania in the colonial period, people studied a combination of English, some Swahili, some of their own ethnic language in school. All were spoken. After independence in Tanzania, there was a very strong emphasis on Swahili. Swahili is a language that was originally spoken on the coast of East Africa by the people basically that lived on the Indian Ocean, only a minority of the population. But because those people who lived on the coast were traders that went far into the interior of the country, a lot of people knew some Swahili. It was the language of trade and business, basically. So in marketplaces in Kenya and Tanzania, people spoke Swahili. That was the language of business. Nyerere pushed through a language policy that made Swahili the official language in schools, in governments, on TV, on radio, and said Swahili is central to what it means to be a Tanzanian. Tanzanians are going to speak perfect Swahili, grammatical Swahili. They're going to study it. They subsidized Swahili literature, Swahili theater, Swahili poetry. They did everything they could to create a vibrant intellectual life in Swahili. Kenya had no coherent language policy. They continued this kind of mixture of some things being conducted in English, some in Swahili, some in the local language, and it wasn't a coherent policy. Beyond the language policy, the curriculum in Tanzanian schools early on changed very dramatically. There was an attempt at what you could call political socialization. And the socialization was meant to give Tanzanians a lot of pride in being Tanzanian and also in being African. So there's a tremendous emphasis, even to this day in Tanzanian textbooks, about the importance of Pan-African identity, the commonality of the African experience because of slavery, colonialism. For some of our work, we actually gathered Kenyan and Tanzanian textbooks, and you can just count the number of times they talk about African history or African culture or being an African, and there's more than 2 times as many mentions in all the Tanzanian books as the Kenyan books. So there's a very strong identity component here from early on. Of course, during the socialist period, there was also a lot of emphasis on African socialism in Tanzania, as they called it. A couple of other major changes. Within a year or 2 of coming to power after independence, Julius Nyerere abolished all tribal chiefs in Tanzania. So in Kenya and Tanzania, people had inherited a system of local chiefs. Local chiefs that had some authority, a little bit like Sierra Leone, some authority over land, some authority over controlling crime, some authority over various community affairs. Nyerere said, look, we're all Tanzanians, we're not members of different tribes. There are no more tribal chiefs in Tanzania. They do not exist, they're not recognized, and every village got a village council, which was meant to be an elected village council, a democratic institution to replace tribal chiefs. In Kenya, to this day, there are tribal chiefs that belong to the dominant local ethnic group and still have some authority over law and order and security issues, again, a little bit like Sierra Leone. That's a big distinction. In Kenya, in a particular region, you know which chief or sub-chief you're under in that area. And the ethnic group of that chief or sub-chief sort of labels that area as almost belonging to a particular ethnic group. People think about it in that way. So even in diverse areas, if the chief belongs to a certain group, that's kind of that group's territory. That doesn't happen in Tanzania because there's no tribal chiefs in Tanzania. A final point that's important is there was a lot of emphasis on redistribution in Tanzania to poorer areas, to build roads and schools and wells, not just in the sort of richest areas, but everywhere. In Kenya, there was a lot of focus on Kenyatta's home region. In fact, the paper we'll talk about on Tuesday will show that quantitatively. So there was just a lot of differences. Tanzania was much more egalitarian and basically de-emphasized tribe and tried to promote a common national identity. Yeah. Some efforts, there was some opposition to, some not. The abolition of the tribal chiefs was very little backlash to. It was done right after independence. Nyerere was so popular, he was able to basically just get rid of them. Language policy, people were excited about, I think. There was a lot of support for that. Where there was growing backlash over time was a lot of the socialist economic policies. So what happened early on in the 60s and into the early 70s is there were a lot of these kind of cultural and educational reforms. Language policy, educational curriculum, the chiefs, etc. In the 70s, there was a lot more radical economic reform. Collectivization, nationalization of industry. There was also a big attempt to force people to live in villages. People in many parts of Tanzania lived on their farms in a scattered way. And the idea was, if everybody lives in a central village, it'll be a lot cheaper to provide public goods, because in that central village, we'll build a well and a school and a grain storage facility, which no one would ever steal from, obviously, and on and on. And there was a lot of resistance to that. And in 73, 74 especially, when it was clear they'd been trying to get people to move into villages for a few years and people weren't, they literally brought in the army and forced people at gunpoint to move into villages. That was a huge turning point that led to backlash, as you'd imagine. That's really basically violent behavior. Yeah, there's this rationale, which is there's this efficiency gain to say, instead of all of us living on our farms over these, however, 10 square kilometers scattered, let's all move to a central village and provide all these public goods. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't clear. I meant going from like living in a remote farm to living in a town, basically. Living in a little town. That was basically the sort of forced villagization. Do you have a comment? Yeah, you're going to continue? I cut you off. Or? Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, and huge changes. There's been a lot of urbanization in Africa as well. Not really because of forced policies of this kind. People move, of their own volition. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great topic, but maybe I'll come back to it. We could take 5 lectures talking about that. And there's actually a lot of recent work on urbanization in Africa that I was thinking of putting on the syllabus this term, and I sort of hesitated. Maybe next year, if there's interest, I'll do that. So, okay, that's where there was the backlash. Nyerere ruled until 1985, and he stepped down because he was increasingly unpopular. There was an economic crisis, and he stepped down and sort of worked as an elder statesman for the rest of his career. He didn't run for office, but he did diplomatic work for Tanzania until the end of his life. He died in 1999. So Nyerere, when he saw the writing on the wall, basically stepped down, transitioned, and democratized. Basically allowed, he allowed multipartyism, etc. Okay, clicker question. I just mentioned a bunch of these different things that happened in Tanzania that may have helped to build a sense of national identity and maybe bridge these divides across nations. Which do you think, just in the brief discussion so far, we'll talk more about them, was probably had most impact? Using promoting Swahili as a national language, having a more nationalistic or Pan-Africanist curriculum, abolishing tribal chiefs, equitable investment, or is it sort of impossible to say? Go ahead and speak with your neighbor if you want. The guy's usually there, isn't he? Okay, so pretty interesting. A lot of people said Swahili. Some people said the schooling curriculum, abolishing chiefs, equitable investment. It's impossible to say. It is kind of impossible to say. These are all plausible. And in fact, this is one of the limitations of the study I'll show you is we can compare Kenya and Tanzania, but we don't know exactly what did most of the work in Tanzania. Was it language? Was it abolishing chiefs? But it's interesting to get people's take on what they thought was most plausible. It's certainly the case that Tanzanians today are very proud of how well they speak Swahili. And within East Africa, even though most people speak Swahili in Kenya, a lot of people speak in Uganda, a lot of people in Rwanda, Burundi, and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo also speak Swahili. But everybody knows the Tanzanians are the ones who speak beautiful Swahili. They actually know grammatical Swahili. So when Kenyans go to Tanzania, they're really embarrassed because they get all their verb conjugations wrong. And there's all these shortcuts that Kenyans use in their Swahili, whereas in Tanzania they kind of speak it properly. So it's a very important part of Tanzanian identity right now, actually, to speak Swahili well. Yeah. So that's very interesting. English would be the next language learned. So anybody who's gone to high school in Tanzania, and certainly beyond to university, will have had a lot of exposure to English. But someone who's only had, say, 6, 7, 8 years of schooling, maybe they finished primary around that level, a Kenyan with that amount of schooling speaks much better English than a Tanzanian with that amount of schooling. So there's an interesting trade-off you could think of, which is maybe Swahili binds Tanzanians together and gives them this strong identity. But maybe if you think speaking English helps you get better jobs or access information, or if a factory is going to move into Nairobi or Dar es Salaam, they're just going to find better English speakers in Nairobi for kind of low-wage or semi-skilled wage work. So there could be an economic cost to it. Yeah. In Tanzania, above a certain level, not in primary school, but above primary school, they start learning English. But the curriculum is fully in Swahili. And then in university, there's a lot of English. I think they recognize at that level they need a lot of English. But even in high school, it's predominantly in Swahili in Tanzania. Remember, we spoke about the national schools in Kenya, where most people don't speak Swahili that well in Kenya. But if you go to a national school, there was actually a bit of emphasis on Swahili in the Kenyan national school. So they do teach it a little bit more, but nothing like how the Tanzanians do Swahili. Because the Tanzanians study science in Swahili, they study poetry in Swahili, they do everything in Swahili. It's really their language. And you can ask yourself, I don't have an answer to this, but people have made this point. Ask yourself the question: what does it do to one's identity if the language you're educated in, you're in Africa in a post-independent state, if the language you're educated in is a European language rather than an African language? Swahili is an African language with African words for things. Fundamentally, does it change your notion of self and notion of national or ethnic pride if that's the case? And that's an open question, but there's some famous African authors who stopped writing in English for exactly this reason. There's a famous Kenyan author named Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Sorry, that's a U. That doesn't look very good, does it? Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote some very popular books and some plays in English in the 60s and 70s, and was actually quite well read in the English-speaking world as a whole as a sort of up-and-coming African author, who in, I think,